whilst constables were, in theory, also entrusted with the protection of property for the working classes, in practice, they focused primarily on the private prosecutions brought by the rich because these are the people who could pay them. By the 1820s, though, some 40 years prior to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which was definitely accurately and historically depicted in cinematic classic National Treasure 2, Book of Secrets. But yeah, by the 1820s, the nature of society is changing, and this system of private constables is in need of reform in order to keep protecting the interests of the elite. So the main shifts were in the rise of urbanization and industrialization. So whereas before society had been structured around this kind of patchwork of semi-rural towns and smaller cities where a lot of the labor is agrarian based, we are actually kind of doing a kind of history of agrarian reform here. By this point, we're really starting to see the rise of big cities and factory labor. So the reason that factory labor was so substantively different is because it was a much more organized form of labor with larger workforces where the workers are working and also living in much closer contact with each other. So what do we get at this time? That's right, we get the rise of trade unionism and civil protest. So because of this, we get things like the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, where 60,000 workers had gathered in central Manchester to demand, amongst other things, the right to vote, and were then violently, quote-unquote, dispersed by the town militia, leading to the deaths of an estimated 18 people and the injury of several hundred more. This was obviously very alarming to elites. Another thing that was alarming was the rise of so-called volume crime. So this referred to a phenomena where the individually more lucrative but also more patchwork system of like highway robberies that had predominated in the 18th century came to be replaced by a much more pervasive system of minor thefts and daylight robberies. So things like street muggings by groups of working class men in cities. The issue presented by volume crime and trade unionism for traditional policing was that the old constabulary system lacked the central organization and oversight to effectively address these larger scale threats. So under the old system, constables were more or less like free to get on with things as they saw fit. Essentially, the problem was that whilst a patchwork system of individual free agent constables was suitable for addressing property crimes against the rich when it was also primarily made up of a patchwork of highway robberies, and able to more or less like keep the poor in check when they weren't so heavily concentrated within large cities, this system could not provide the level of social control needed to address the more ubiquitous phenomenon of volume crime and the more organized phenomenon of 19th century trade unionism and civil protest. So, where were the pre-existing examples of this kind of social control that police reformers in England could pull on? That's right, it's the fucking colonies. So that's like 10 minutes in before we even mention colonialism. I think that might be some new record, gold stars all round. But anyway, back to the 1820s. So what happens is that the police, once composed of this like middle class free agent constabulary model, is submitted to what historian Chris Williams has called a process of proletarianization, i.e. they come to look more like the modern industrial labor force that they are being deployed to control, with management structures, strict oversight, and set wages. This new reformed model of policing looked a lot more like the models of social control already operational in the colonies, where the agents of social control were also closer to the proletariat or working class than the middle class. Now, traditionally, historians have argued that the London Metropolitan Police, which was founded in 1829, was the first modern police force, and that this model was then the blueprint for other modernizing police forces, notably in the United States. However, I'm going to argue that the reverse actually happened. The Met was not the blueprint for policing in the colonies, rather policing in the colonies was the blueprint for the Met. So the divide and rule strategy of social control eventually deployed by the new Metropolitan Police in the mid-1800s was actually first developed and perfected in the slave colonies of the Americas and the Caribbean. The reconceptualization of the police as an organized paramilitary force originated not with the creation of the so-called Bobby, but with the colonization of Ireland and the creation of the ironically named Peace Preservation Force in 1814. The links between these historical injustices and the Met are not just about similarities in form. They don't just look like they might have influenced each other. It's not just that they have like a similar vibe. Rather, I'm going to show you how two of the key reformers involved in actually creating the Met were also directly involved in these processes of colonization. So let's take this chronologically and go to the example of plantation slave societies first. So it's estimated that somewhere between 12 and 12.8 million Africans were enslaved as part of the transatlantic slave trade between the 1600s and the 1800s. Now, obviously, this is just like a really enormous number of people, right? And whilst about 10 to 15% of these would have actually died en route to the colonies due to the deadly conditions aboard the slave ships, the end result was still that white colonizers in the Americas and the Caribbean very quickly became a racial minority. For example, by the 1700s, many Caribbean colonies were between 70 and 90% black. And in order to maintain stringent social control over what was essentially the vast majority of the population, particularly once poor whites were factored into the mix as a subpopulation to be controlled, two key institutions emerged. First, the slave patrol, and second, the plantation overseer. So the slave patrol system was fairly straightforward. Patrols served two purposes: to prevent revolts and to hunt down fugitive slaves. But the crucial element underpinning the patrol system were the slave codes, which were sets of laws established in colonies in the mid-1600s, and they set about like the specific terms of enslavement. So they were essentially kind of like the rules of how slavery worked.